Linda Crowley was a 72-year-old widow known for her quiet charm and perfect rose garden. Ethan Crowley, her 24-year-old grandson, was the polite, soft-spoken young man who moved in to help out. But behind their closed doors, the pair were hiding a relationship so twisted, so taboo, it would end not only in betrayal but in a murder that would shock the nation. Maple Ridge sat tucked between evergreen hills and winding back roads, a town so quiet it almost seemed frozen in time. There were no high-rises, no traffic, and barely any crime. Most people who lived there had been born there. Those who moved in were either escaping city life or looking for somewhere to grow old in peace. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, your family, and the color of your curtains. People left their doors unlocked and trusted the silence. That trust, as it would later turn out, was misplaced. At the heart of Maple Ridge, in a modest two-story colonial house with chipped blue paint and white shutters, lived Linda Crowley. She was 72, retired, and had spent most of her life teaching middle school English. After her husband, Harold, died from a heart attack in 2015, she had remained in the family home, living a quiet, unremarkable life. Neighbors described her as polite but private, someone who kept to herself but always nodded from the front porch. Her yard was her pride, especially the rose garden, which exploded into color every spring. The neighbors saw her trimming, watering, and sometimes just staring at her roses as if they were her last connection to something beautiful in the world. Things began to shift in the fall of 2022 when her grandson, Ethan Crowley, moved in. He was 24 and the only child of Linda's estranged son, Mark. Ethan had never been close to his parents. He dropped out of college after his first year and had floated between jobs. The official story was that he was trying to get back on his feet and help care for his aging grandmother. In a town like Maple Ridge, that explanation was more than enough. People welcomed Ethan with soft smiles and short conversations, assuming he was just another young man lost in the fog of early adulthood. But even early on, there were signs that something was off. The change was subtle, but it was there. Linda stopped attending the book club she had been a part of for over a decade. She no longer joined the church gatherings on Sundays. Her garden, once immaculately kept, began to decay. The roses were overtaken by weeds. The edges of the lawn turned brown. People noticed her walking with her head down, always in a hurry, avoiding small talk. When asked about Ethan, she gave short, vague answers. "He's doing fine," she would say, without elaborating. Ethan, for his part, was barely visible. He didn't mingle with the neighbors and never stayed outside long enough to start a conversation. Some said they saw him smoking on the back porch late at night, pacing or just staring into the trees. His car rarely moved from the driveway. A few people assumed he was depressed or maybe just socially anxious. No one pushed. Maple Ridge wasn't the kind of place where you dug into people's business until you had to. Over the next year, the Crowley home seemed to fall into a strange rhythm. Linda and Ethan were rarely seen together, but lights in the house stayed on well past midnight. Packages began arriving more frequently. Books, electronics, and once, a large freezer unit. One delivery driver noted how oddly quiet the house felt. He described it as dead silent, like no one even breathed in there. But again, no one thought too much of it. People in small towns give space until they're given a reason not to. The first real alarm came in the form of a missed appointment. Linda failed to show up for her yearly physical at the local clinic. Then she missed a dental checkup. Calls went unanswered. Eventually, the church tried reaching out. Still nothing. Someone left a basket on her porch and it sat untouched for days. It was around this time that a neighbor, an older woman named Joan, began to suspect something wasn't right. She had lived next door to the Crowleys for 20 years. She remembered Linda as cheerful and reliable. Now the house next door felt wrong, not just neglected, something deeper. She noticed the blinds were always drawn, and the air around the property felt heavy. When she mentioned it to others, they shrugged it off. But Joan couldn't shake the feeling that the silence in the Crowley home wasn't peaceful. It was hiding something. Eventually, it was Joan who made the call to the police for a welfare check, unknowingly setting off a chain of events that would shatter the illusion of Maple Ridge's quiet safety. and reveal a truth far more disturbing than anyone in the town could have imagined. Ethan Crowley's arrival in Maple Ridge had seemed unremarkable at first. A quiet young man with sunken eyes and an awkward posture, he drew little attention from the townspeople. He rarely left the house and often kept the blinds closed even during daylight. When he did go out, usually late in the evening, he moved quickly and avoided eye contact. People chalked it up to social anxiety or personal struggles. Small towns have a way of excusing odd behavior if there's no immediate threat. Inside the Crowley home, however, a different world was taking shape. With no one else around and few obligations, Ethan and his grandmother Linda began spending nearly all their time together. What started as simple companionship soon turned into emotional entanglement. Ethan, isolated and directionless, found comfort in the only consistent figure in his life. Linda, increasingly dependent and lonely since her husband's death, began to lean on Ethan in ways that blurred the lines of normal family roles. Their routines grew obsessive. Eating meals at the same time each day, watching old films in silence, and rarely being apart even for an hour. Psychological dependency is rarely obvious from the outside, but within the confines of their home, it became suffocating. They developed their own language of glances and gestures. Neither seemed willing to spend time apart, and any attempts Ethan made to regain independence, such as applying for work or reconnecting with his father, were quickly sabotaged. Linda would fall sick unexpectedly, or beg him to stay, suggesting the world outside was unsafe, filled with people who didn't understand them. At some point, the bond shifted from emotional to physical, though no one on the outside knew. Linda and Ethan began to see themselves not as grandmother and grandson, but as equals locked in a world they had created together. It was a fantasy built on codependence, secrecy, and delusion. This shift was gradual, hidden behind drawn curtains and locked doors. Ethan stopped reaching out to old friends. His social media accounts went inactive. Phone calls to his father stopped altogether. He was disappearing, not just from the outside world, but from the person he used to be. Their relationship became a closed circuit of obsession and control. Linda saw Ethan as her last chance at love and belonging. Ethan, emotionally immature and psychologically trapped, saw her as the only person who had ever truly accepted him. Together they formed a pact built not on reality, but on mutual need and denial. The danger was not just in the nature of their relationship, but in how far they were willing to go to protect it. Paranoia began creeping into their daily lives. Linda became convinced that neighbors were watching them, that someone would find out and ruin everything. Ethan started checking the locks multiple times a night. They avoided windows. They stopped answering the door. Linda began hoarding supplies, canned food, bottled water, over-the-counter medication. She feared exposure more than anything else, and that fear began to control their every move. One of the most disturbing developments came in the form of Linda's will. Just 6 months after Ethan moved in, she had rewritten it, naming him as the sole beneficiary. Her lawyer, based in a neighboring town, later admitted he found the change unusual but not illegal. Linda had insisted it was a reward for Ethan's unwavering care and loyalty. That same month, she transferred ownership of the house into both their names. Financial control soon followed. Linda gave Ethan full access to her bank accounts, explaining it was easier for him to manage things online. He used the money sparingly at first, buying groceries, paying utilities, but then larger purchases began appearing. A deep freezer, surveillance cameras, several external hard drives. Linda never questioned him. She trusted him entirely, or perhaps she had surrendered the need to ask questions at all. Behind the thick silence of their home, the relationship grew darker. Arguments became common. Ethan, now more aware of how wrong everything was, began to pull away emotionally. He expressed interest in finding work, maybe moving out to restart his life. This triggered intense reactions in Linda, emotional breakdowns, threats of self-harm, and long periods of silence that left Ethan racked with guilt. She reminded him that no one else would accept him, no one else would understand. He believed her, at least for a while. But something inside Ethan had started to shift. The fantasy they built was beginning to crack, and through those cracks, he saw a different life, one where he was free. He began writing notes, recording thoughts, keeping a secret folder on his laptop. He was planning something, though he didn't yet know if it would be an escape or an exposure. He only knew that the life he was living couldn't go on much longer. Unbeknownst to him, Linda had sensed the change too, and she was already thinking of how to stop it. The first official sign that something was wrong came on a gray morning in early February. A clerk at the local grocery store mentioned that she hadn't seen Ethan Crowley in weeks. He used to come in once or twice a week, always alone, picking up basics like bread, eggs, and canned soup. His last visit had been nearly a month earlier, and even then, something about him seemed off. He looked thinner, more nervous. He had fumbled with cash at the register, barely made eye contact, and left without saying a word. When Linda returned to the store the following week, someone casually asked how Ethan was doing. She smiled briefly and said he had gone back to California to reconnect with his father. Her voice was steady, but her answer felt rehearsed. There was no warmth in her tone, no elaboration. She paid for her groceries and left quickly, avoiding any further questions. At first, no one pressed her for more details. People disappear from small towns all the time, often quietly. But the silence around Ethan's sudden absence grew louder with each passing day. Linda had never been especially sociable, but now she seemed almost invisible. The curtains remained drawn at all hours. Mail began to pile up on the porch. The trash bin sat at the curb untouched for weeks. Joan, the neighbor who had known Linda for decades, noticed that the once carefully tended rose garden had fully withered. Dead vines snaked across the yard. The air around the house felt heavy, as if it were holding its breath. Concerned, Joan called the police for a wellness check. She explained to the dispatcher that she hadn't seen Ethan in over a month, and that Linda was acting strangely. She also mentioned the smell. Something faint but foul had begun drifting from the Crowley property on warmer days. It wasn't strong, but it lingered, an unfamiliar rot that didn't belong. A pair of officers arrived the next afternoon. Linda answered the door slowly, looking thinner and paler than they expected. She was calm, but distant. She repeated the story about Ethan leaving for California and said she hadn't yet heard from him since. The officers asked to look around the house. She allowed them inside but guided them carefully, avoiding certain rooms. The interior was dim and cold. The heat had been turned down and most of the house felt abandoned. Dust clung to the furniture. The officers noted a padlock on the basement door, which Linda claimed had been Ethan's private space. She said she hadn't entered since he left. Something about the scene felt wrong, but there was no immediate evidence of a crime. The officers filed their report and left, but one of them made a note to recommend a follow-up. The following morning, the department secured a search warrant after Ethan's father reported his son missing. He had received no calls, no texts, no emails. Ethan's bank accounts were inactive. His phone went straight to voicemail. A digital footprint that had once been faint had now gone completely dark. With the warrant in hand, police returned to the Crowley home. Linda was not there. She had gone to a doctor's appointment that morning, giving investigators a rare window of uninterrupted access. They moved quickly. The house was still as cold and quiet as before. They moved room to room, noting the stale air, the unopened mail, the heavy layers of dust. When they reached the basement door, they broke the lock and descended into the darkness. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes of books, and broken appliances. In one corner stood a large, chest-style freezer, recently plugged in. It was unusually new compared to the rest of the room. They forced it open. Inside, they found Ethan's body, wrapped in painter's plastic and tightly sealed with layers of duct tape. His limbs were contorted unnaturally to fit the space. Underneath the wrapping, he was wearing the same clothes witnesses had last seen him in at the grocery store. His face was bruised and the back of his skull was fractured. Later autopsy reports would reveal a combination of blunt force trauma and a strong sedative in his system, enough to render him unconscious, but not enough to kill him outright. Linda was arrested at her doctor's office an hour later without resistance. She didn't ask why. She didn't speak at all. Word spread through Maple Ridge like wildfire. The Crowley house was sealed off with police tape. Forensic teams moved in. Journalists arrived before nightfall, drawn by the grotesque nature of the crime and the shocking dynamic between victim and killer. In just 24 hours, the quiet little town had been turned into the epicenter of a nightmare, and no one, not even those who had lived next door, could believe what had really been going on behind those closed doors. The trial of Linda Crowley was unlike anything the county courthouse had ever seen. By the time proceedings began, the story had already traveled far beyond the borders of Maple Ridge. National media outlets picked it up within days of her arrest, and each new detail seemed more disturbing than the last. The headline alone, an elderly woman murdering her grandson under the shadow of a twisted, secret relationship, was enough to draw attention. But the real shock came from what investigators uncovered in the weeks leading up to the trial. Forensic teams scoured the Crowley house for evidence, and what they found painted a grim and deeply unsettling picture. Ethan had not just been living in isolation, he had been monitored. Police discovered multiple hidden cameras throughout the house, including in private spaces like the bathroom and bedroom. All footage was routed to a network of hard drives locked in a metal cabinet in the basement. On those drives were hundreds of hours of video, recordings of daily life, arguments, and intimate moments that confirmed the inappropriate nature of Linda and Ethan's relationship. These recordings became a focal point for the prosecution. While most of the material was deemed too explicit to be shown in court, experts testified to its contents. A clinical psychologist explained how prolonged isolation, manipulation, and trauma could have led Ethan to normalize a situation that was abusive at its core. The defense, meanwhile, tried to argue diminished responsibility. They claimed Linda was mentally unwell, citing age-related cognitive decline and grief-induced delusion. But prosecutors countered with compelling evidence of calculated behavior, search history logs, digital files, and notes that showed Linda had planned to maintain control over Ethan long before his death. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a handwritten journal found under Linda's mattress. In it, she had recorded her thoughts with chilling clarity. There were entries about her fear of losing Ethan, her anger when he mentioned leaving, and detailed reflections on their connection, which she described in obsessive, possessive terms. Near the end of the journal, an entry read simply, "If he leaves, everything ends. I won't allow it." Ethan's voice was heard too, though only through fragments. On one of the hard drives, investigators found a series of secret recordings he had made using a small audio recorder hidden in a desk drawer. In those files, he described feeling trapped, confused, and ashamed. He mentioned wanting to go to the police but fearing what would happen if the truth got out. In one of the last recordings he said, "If something happens to me, she did it. Please don't let her talk her way out of it." This was played for the jury. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Ethan's voice, young, tired, and filled with fear. It was a moment that changed the tone of the entire trial. Up until that point, Linda had been seen by some as frail, perhaps even pitiable. But that recording stripped away any doubt. The jury now saw her not as a confused elderly woman, but as a predator who had trapped her grandson in a nightmare he could never escape from. Linda herself remained mostly silent throughout the trial. She refused to testify and showed little emotion as witnesses described her actions. Her lawyer maintained the argument of mental instability, but psychological evaluations submitted by the prosecution concluded she was fully aware of her actions. She may have been lonely, disturbed even, but she was not delusional. She had made conscious choices, dangerous, destructive ones. The jury deliberated for 6 days. There was tension in the courtroom as they returned with a verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. The judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Linda Crowley, once a retired teacher known for baking pies and trimming roses, was now a convicted murderer whose story would haunt Maple Ridge for generations. Outside the courthouse, people gathered. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others in disbelief. A few, including former students of Linda's, wept quietly. struggling to reconcile the woman they once knew with the monster described in court. The Crowley name, once respected in town, became synonymous with horror and shame. No one had expected the trial to uncover so much darkness. The truth had been buried beneath a mask of normalcy for years, and when it was finally unearthed, it stunned even the most seasoned investigators. It wasn't just a murder. It was a life stolen through manipulation, fear, and a desperate need for control. And in the end, it was a story no one could ever truly forget. After the trial ended and the verdict was read, Maple Ridge tried to return to normal. But the sense of safety the town had once taken for granted was gone. What had unfolded behind the doors of the Crowley house was too horrific, too incomprehensible to forget. Even those who hadn't known Linda or Ethan personally felt the weight of what had happened. It was as though the entire town had been forced to confront the possibility that darkness could exist anywhere, even in the most familiar faces and the most ordinary homes. The Crowley house remained sealed for weeks after the trial. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, and a sign marked the property as a crime scene under state investigation. People crossed the street to avoid walking too close. Eventually, the property was deemed too stigmatized to sell. The foundation was cracked, the walls stained by time and silence, and the value of the home had plummeted. A year after Linda's conviction, the house was demolished quietly one morning before sunrise. A bulldozer leveled the structure in hours. By the afternoon, only a flattened lot remained. The town tried to forget it had ever been there, but memory has a way of lingering, especially in small towns. Stories began to circulate, some true, some twisted by rumor. Kids dared each other to step onto the empty lot. Some claimed to hear voices. Others swore the area felt colder than the rest of the neighborhood. Whether these stories were real or invented, they were fueled by a collective need to process something that still felt unreal. Linda herself never served long behind bars. Less than 11 months into her life sentence, she was found dead in her cell at the state correctional facility. The official cause was a heart attack, but speculation quickly followed. Some believed she had taken her own life. Others suspected she had been attacked by another inmate after word of her crime spread through the prison. But no evidence supported either theory. She died quietly, as she had lived in her final years, isolated, distrusted, and alone. Her body was cremated with no family present to claim her ashes. Ethan's death, however, left a longer shadow. His father, Mark Crowley, returned to Maple Ridge briefly to attend a small memorial service. He hadn't spoken to Ethan in nearly 2 years at the time of his death, a fact that haunted him for the rest of his life. Mark had always believed his son was struggling, but never imagined the extent of his suffering. He later admitted in an interview that he had ignored signs, choosing to believe that Ethan was just going through a rough patch. That guilt, he said, would never go away. In the months following the trial, a number of investigative documentaries and true crime podcasts took an interest in the case. Some focused on the psychological elements, how abuse can thrive in silence, how control can masquerade as love. Others leaned into the sensationalism, dissecting the taboo relationship, the hidden recordings, and the eerie normalcy of the town that let it all happen unnoticed. Interviews with neighbors, former students, and even a retired officer who had once visited the house for an unrelated matter painted a picture of missed opportunities and ignored warning signs. A small foundation was later established in Ethan's name, organized by a former counselor from his school years. It aimed to provide support for young adults experiencing domestic abuse and mental health crises, especially those trapped in isolated or manipulative family situations. Though modest in reach, the foundation helped keep Ethan's story from being reduced to a headline. It served as a reminder that he was more than a victim. He was a young man who had tried to escape, who had left behind warnings, and who had hoped, in his final days, that someone would listen. Years passed, but the case remained etched in Maple Ridge's memory. Residents spoke about it in hushed tones. Some avoided the topic entirely. Others brought it up only as a cautionary tale. Over time, new families moved into the neighborhood, unaware of what had taken place. The empty lot where the Crowley house once stood grew wild with weeds, untouched, almost as if the earth itself had chosen not to forget. What happened between Linda and Ethan was something the legal system tried to understand, something the media tried to explain, and something the community tried to move beyond. But there are some stories that stay with people, not because they want them to, but because they reveal the uncomfortable truth that evil does not always come with warning signs. Sometimes it lives quietly in plain sight, behind a garden of roses, in a house that looks just like yours.